The summer air hung heavy over Gettysburg as June of 1863 drew to a close. Thick with moisture and the scent of ripening wheat, it clung to the skin of Sarah Broadhead as she stood on her porch, watching distant dust clouds rise. From the Chambersburg pike. The mother of two dabbed perspiration from her brow, her gaze fixed on the horizon where rumors had materialized into reality. Those weren't merchant wagons approaching. They were soldiers. "It cannot be," she whispered. But the growing thunder of hoofbeats confirmed what the townspeople had dreaded for weeks. The war was coming to Gettysburg. Just days before, the residents of this Pennsylvania market town of 2,500 souls had gone about their business with cautious optimism. Their community sat at the crossroads of 10 major roads, an intersection of commerce in peacetime, but now a strategic prize in a nation torn asunder. General Robert E. Lee's bold gambit to push northward had transformed their quiet streets into the next potential battlefield. John Burns, a 72-year-old veteran of the War of 1812, stood outside his modest home on Chambersburg Street, squinting at the approaching columns. "They're here now," he announced to no one in particular, his weathered hands gripping the fence post. "God help us all." The first Confederate troops to enter Gettysburg were not the main army, but a brigade under General John Gordon seeking supplies. Their arrival on June 26th sent a shock through the community. Merchants hastily shuttered their shops. Families rushed to hide valuables. The Adams County Bank dispatched its reserves southward to York for safekeeping. Elizabeth Thorne, 6 months pregnant and managing the local cemetery while her husband served in the Union Army, watched from her gatehouse as Confederate cavalry trotted past. "They're taking everything," she wrote in her diary that evening. "Flour, meat, horses, anything they can carry." As reported in the Philadelphia Inquirer days later, the rebel incursion into Gettysburg was marked by methodical appropriation of goods rather than wanton destruction, with payment offered in Confederate currency, which locals well understood had no value north of the Mason-Dixon line. At the Globe Inn, proprietor John Wills frantically directed his staff to move barrels of whiskey into hidden cellars. "They'll drink us dry if they find it," he cautioned, "and hungry soldiers with liquor are the devil's own children." The town's black residents faced the greatest peril. Having built a vibrant community in Gettysburg, they now confronted the horrifying prospect of capture by Confederate troops who viewed them as property to be reclaimed. Basil Biggs, a free black farmer and veterinarian who had prospered on the outskirts of town, gathered his family under cover of darkness. "We must reach the mountains," he told his wife and children as they loaded a single wagon with provisions. "We cannot be here when the main army arrives." By June 30th, the tension had reached a breaking point. Telegraph lines to the south had been cut. The railroad connections severed. Gettysburg had become an island in a rising tide of war. Town leaders like David McConaughey and David Wills convened hasty meetings to prepare the citizenry for what might come. That night, 15-year-old Tilly Pierce huddled with her family in their home on Baltimore Street. "Father says we must be ready to flee at a moment's notice," she confided to her diary. "Though where one might flee when armies surround us on all sides, I cannot imagine." As dawn broke on July 1st, 1863, few in Gettysburg slept. The distant rumble that many mistook for summer thunder grew steadily louder from the northwest. Union cavalry under General John Buford had established positions on McPherson's Ridge, and the first skirmishes were already underway. The 3-day nightmare that would transform their town forever had begun. For the civilians of Gettysburg, caught between the colliding armies of a divided nation, the struggle for survival would test not just their courage, but their very conception of humanity in the face of unimaginable horror. Mary Virginia, Jenny, weighed kneaded dough with practiced hands in her sister's kitchen on Baltimore Street as the first artillery shells whistled overhead. At 20 years old, she had volunteered to care for her sister, who had given birth just days before. The thunderous boom that followed each whistling projectile made the windows rattle, but Jenny continued her work. "The soldiers will need bread," she insisted to her frightened mother, flour dusting her forearms. "We cannot stop now." By mid-morning on July 1st, the streets of Gettysburg had transformed from anxious quiet to chaotic evacuation. The battle that began on McPherson's Ridge, a mile west of town, was rapidly approaching. Union forces under General John Reynolds were engaging with Confederate divisions commanded by A.P. Hill, and the fighting intensified with each passing. Our Professor Michael Jacobs of Pennsylvania College, later Gettysburg College, had been meticulously recording weather conditions for years. That morning, he noted not only the temperature, 87 degrees by noon, but also the unfolding human storm. "The college edifice will surely become a hospital," he wrote, hurriedly preparing to evacuate his scientific instruments to safety. According to accounts published in the New York Tribune, the citizens of Gettysburg found themselves transformed from spectators to participants in the great drama of war, with many homes becoming impromptu field hospitals even before the first day's fighting had concluded. At the Adams County Courthouse, Judge Samuel Russell abandoned legal proceedings as the first wounded soldiers staggered into town. Courthouse pews were quickly repurposed as beds. The marble floors, soon slick with blood, became operating tables where harried surgeons worked with grim determination. Liberty Hollinger, a 10-year-old girl watching from her home on Middle Street, later recalled the moment when the battle reached town itself. It was like the world had ended. Men were running and shouting. Some fell in the street and did not get up again. A soldier came to our door and told us to go to the cellar, and we did. My mother prayed aloud the entire time. By mid-afternoon, the Union line had collapsed. General Reynolds had been killed, and Northern forces were retreating through Gettysburg streets toward Cemetery Hill. The carefully planned grid of the town became a deadly maze as Confederate sharpshooters took positions in upper windows, and Union stragglers tried to find safe passage south. Daniel Skelly, a 17-year-old clerk, had climbed to the cupola of the Fonestock building for a better view of the distant battle, only to find himself trapped when the fighting engulfed the town. "I lay flat on the cupola floor," he later wrote, "as bullets struck all around me. Below I could see the Union soldiers running, and behind them, the Confederates giving chase with those terrible rebel yells." In the downtown area, John Burns, the septuagenarian veteran who had watched the troops arrive days before, did something extraordinary. Donning his War of 1812 uniform coat and grabbing his flintlock musket, he approached a Union officer and volunteered to fight. Directed to a position with the Iron Brigade, the old man fought valiantly until wounded 3 times. As Confederate forces secured the town by evening, Gettysburg civilians faced their first night under occupation. Homes were commandeered for headquarters and hospitals. The wounded from both sides groaned in churches, public buildings, barns, and private residences. The suffering had only begun. Carrie Sheeds, principal of the Young Ladies' Seminary, transformed her school into a hospital as wounded Union officers were brought to her door. "One captain begged me to hide his sword," she remembered. "I placed it between mattresses just before Confederate soldiers came searching the rooms." As night fell, many residents huddled in cellars, the safest place from stray bullets and artillery. Sarah Broadhead wrote by candlelight in her basement, "The house trembles with the firing of cannon. What will become of us all? The Confederates control the town, but we hear the Union holds the hills to the south. Tomorrow may bring even greater horror." She was right. As Gettysburg civilians endured their first night of battle, neither they nor the soldiers occupying their town could imagine the cataclysm that would unfold when dawn broke on July 2nd. The bloodiest fighting still lay ahead, and the town caught between 2 great armies would be forever changed by what the coming days would bring. Dawn broke on July 2nd, with an eerie silence that fooled no one. From their basement refuge, the Cullison family on York Street ventured cautiously upstairs to find Confederate soldiers sleeping on their porch, in their garden, even in their kitchen. 17-year-old Anna Cullison would later recount how a young Southern lieutenant apologized for the intrusion while drinking coffee from her mother's prize china. "We are not barbarians, miss," he assured her, tipping his hat, "though I cannot speak for what will happen when the fighting resumes." Resume it did. By 10 o'clock, the artillery duel began anew, with Union guns on Cemetery Hill firing over ice, the town toward Confederate positions to the north and west. For Gettysburg's trapped civilians, This meant shells from both armies were now arcing over their homes, some falling short with devastating consequences. The Wills family had taken shelter in their cellar alongside 3 neighboring families. 27 people crammed into a space designed for storing preserves and root vegetables. 8-year-old Harry Wills later described the scene. The ladies tried to keep us children from hearing the terrible noises by singing hymns, but when the house above us was struck, the dust fell between the floorboards and everyone stopped to listen. According to documentation in the Gettysburg compiler, no fewer than 60 civilian structures suffered direct artillery damage during the battle, with the southern and central portions of town bearing the heaviest bombardment as both armies attempted to dislodge the other's positions. For those caught in field hospitals, the situation grew dire. Elizabeth Masser Thorne, the pregnant cemetery caretaker, found herself pressed into service preparing meals for wounded officers in her gatehouse home. "I cooked for 3 days with barely a break," she later recalled. "The smell of blood mixed with the smell of bread. I will never forget it." At Christ Lutheran Church on Chambersburg Street, Reverend Horatio Howell was shot and killed on the front steps by a Confederate soldier while still wearing his chaplain's uniform. The congregation's sanctuary became a surgery, with pews serving as operating tables. Sally Myers, a 21-year-old schoolteacher who volunteered as a nurse, described amputated limbs being thrown from the windows into growing piles outside. "I had never seen a man's bare chest before this day," she wrote in a letter weeks later. "Now I have seen men torn open like slaughtered animals. How strange that I no longer faint at the sight of blood." By afternoon, the battle had shifted, south to places that would become legendary: Little Round Top, the wheat field, the peach orchard, and Devil's Den. Though the town itself saw less direct combat than on the first day, the consequences of battle continued to flow back into Gettysburg's streets in the form of wounded men, prisoners, and desperate refugees. John Rupp's tannery on Baltimore Street became an impromptu hospital for Confederate wounded. The tanner and his family were confined to 2 rooms of their home while surgeons commandeered their kitchen. Catherine Rupp recorded the surreal experience. "They thanked us for the use of our home, as if we had any choice in the matter. One doctor used my sewing scissors to remove a bullet from a boy's shoulder, then wiped them on his pants and handed them back." As fighting intensified to the south, desperate civilians still trapped in town sought any opportunity to reach Union lines. The McLean family made a harrowing dash from their home near Pennsylvania College to Cemetery Hill under escort by a sympathetic Confederate captain who allowed them through the lines as a professional courtesy to Mr. McLean, who was a doctor. 15-year-old Tilly Pierce, who had fled town with neighbors before the battle began, found herself at the Jacob Weichert farm near Little Round Top, directly behind the new Union battle lines. "I went from the frying pan into the fire," she later wrote. "The soldiers were falling like leaves in autumn. The wounded came crawling or were carried to our doorstep. One general died in the very bed where I had slept the night before. By nightfall on July 2nd, Gettysburg had become an island in a crimson sea. To the south, thousands of dead and wounded covered the fields. Within the town, every public building and many private homes served as hospitals. The civilians who remained moved like ghosts through a transformed landscape, their hometown now unrecognizable under the pall of suffering that hung as thick as the summer heat. As darkness fell on the second day, few could sleep despite their exhaustion. The moans of the wounded created a terrible chorus that echoed through the streets. Sarah Broadhead wrote by candlelight, "I wonder if God has forsaken this place entirely. The suffering seems beyond human capacity to bear, yet we must bear it. For what choice do we have?" The night of July 2nd brought no respite, only the knowledge that when morning came, the armies would clash once more. For the civilians of Gettysburg, caught between these grinding millstones of war, survival had become a minute-by-minute struggle, and the third day's planned assault promised even greater calamity than they had yet endured. The morning of July 3rd began with an oppressive stillness. The air hung motionless, already hot at dawn, promising a scorching day ahead. In cellars and makeshift shelters throughout Gettysburg, civilians stirred from fitful sleep to face their third day trapped in the cauldron of battle. Jenny Wade, still at her sister's house on Baltimore Street, continued her determined bread-making for Union soldiers. As she worked the dough in the kitchen, a Confederate sharpshooter's bullet pierced 2 doors before striking her in the back, killing her instantly. She became the only civilian directly killed during the battle, though many would later die from injuries, disease, and the hardships that followed. She never spoke a word, her sister Georgia Wade McClellan later testified. One moment my sister stood there working, the next she was gone from this world. Even in that house of horrors, with a newborn child and bullets flying, I had never imagined such a thing could happen. According to records from the Baltimore Sun, the death of Mary Virginia Wade stands as a stark reminder that in modern warfare, the line between combatant and civilian has been tragically blurred, with her sacrifice becoming emblematic of the home front's vulnerability in this most devastating of American conflicts. By mid-morning, an unnatural quiet had settled over the battlefield. Veterans on both sides recognized the portent. Artillery was being repositioned, infantry formations prepared. Something momentous was coming. In town, Confederate soldiers began to pull back from forward positions, consolidating for what would become the most famous assault of the Civil War. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the world exploded. 170 Confederate cannons opened fire simultaneously, in the largest artillery bombardment ever witnessed on the North American continent. For the civilians of Gettysburg, it seemed as though the very end of days had arrived. The air was filled with flying metal, wrote Henry Eyster Jacobs, son of Professor Michael Jacobs. The concussion was so great that it broke windows all over town. We pressed ourselves against the cellar walls and prayed. For nearly 2 hours the bombardment continued as Union batteries returned fire. In the cellar of the Wagon Hotel, 7-year-old Albertus McCreary covered his ears and screamed while his mother tried to comfort him. Years later, he would recall, "Every shell that struck nearby made the ground shake. Dust fell from between the floorboards above, and I was certain the building would collapse upon us." Then, suddenly, the cannons fell silent. The abrupt cessation of noise was almost as shocking as the bombardment itself. Those who dared peek from their shelters witnessed Confederate infantry forming into lines of battle along Seminary Ridge. What followed was Pickett's charge, 12,500 men advancing across nearly a mile of open ground toward the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. From Daniel Skelly's vantage point in an attic window, they came forward in perfect order, as if on parade, flags flying, bayonets gleaming in the sun. It was the most terrible and magnificent sight I ever beheld. Then the Union artillery opened upon them, and men began to fall as grain before a scythe. The charge failed catastrophically. Within an hour, the field between the ridges was carpeted with Confederate dead and wounded. As the survivors stumbled back toward Seminary Ridge, a new crisis began for Gettysburg civilians. The wounded from this final assault flooded back into town, overwhelming the already strained medical facilities. Harriet Bailey, whose home on York Street had been commandeered as a Confederate field hospital, described the aftermath. "They brought them in on doors, on shutters, on blankets, any way they could carry them. Blood ran down my front steps like rain in a storm. A surgeon used my dining table for amputations until the legs collapsed from the weight and the violence of his saw." As evening approached on the 3rd day, rain began to fall, the first relief from the punishing heat. The downpour became torrential, soaking the wounded who could not find shelter. Lightning illuminated the grotesque landscape of battle as thunder mimicked the cannons that had finally fallen silent. Elizabeth Gilbert, whose home stood at the corner of High and Washington Streets, ventured out during a break in the storm to offer water to wounded Confederate soldiers who lay in the street outside her house. "One boy could not have been more than 16, she wrote afterward. "He held my hand and called me mother before he died. I did not correct him." As night fell on July 3rd, the residents of Gettysburg did not yet know that the battle had effectively ended. They could not know that Lee would begin withdrawing his army the next day. They knew only that they had survived 3 days of hell on earth, and that their town had become one vast hospital, with over 20,000 wounded men needing care. The living had to be tended, the dead buried, and somehow life would need to continue amid the smoking ruins of what had once been their peaceful community. July 4th, 1863 dawned with confusion rather than clarity. The townspeople of Gettysburg emerged cautiously from cellars and hiding places to find the Confederate Army beginning a retreat south toward the Potomac River. What they discovered as they ventured into the light was a landscape transformed beyond recognition. The air itself had changed. The smell was indescribable, recalled pharmacist John Rupp. Death hung everywhere, made worse by the summer heat. We tied handkerchiefs soaked in peppermint oil over our faces, but nothing could truly mask it. 7,000 dead soldiers lay scattered across fields surrounding the town. Another nearly 17,000 wounded remained, the Confederate wounded largely abandoned by their retreating army. The scope of the humanitarian crisis was unprecedented on American soil. Catherine Foster, whose home on Chambersburg Street had miraculously escaped major damage, wrote in her journal, "I had thought during the battle that nothing could be worse than the endless thunder of cannon. I was wrong. The silence that follows, broken only by the cries of suffering men, is far worse." Accounts published in the Washington Chronicle described how the entire community of Gettysburg transformed itself overnight into one vast hospital corps, with women who had never before seen grievous wounds now calmly changing bandages and administering chloroform under the direction of overwhelmed surgeons. For the residents, a new battle began against disease, infection, and the logistical challenge of caring for more wounded than the entire population of their town. The Gettysburg that had existed before July 1st was gone forever. In its place stood a charnel house that would require months to recover from the immediate crisis and years to heal the deeper wounds. Basil Biggs, the free black farmer who had fled with his family before the battle, returned to find his farm devastated. Fields trampled by thousands of soldiers, buildings damaged by artillery, livestock gone. Yet within days, he found himself employed in one of the war's grimmest tasks, the reburial of Union dead, who had initially been placed in shallow graves across the battlefield. "Each body tells its own story," he later recalled. "Some still clutch letters or photographs. Many have no identification at all. We try to mark each one, knowing some mother waits for word that may never come." The civilians of Gettysburg exhibited extraordinary compassion in the aftermath. Homes became long-term hospitals. Church pews served as beds for the wounded until September. Families shared dwindling food supplies with injured enemies, demonstrating humanity that transcended the divisions of war. Sally Myers, the young teacher-turned-nurse, continued caring for wounded soldiers at the Church of the Brethren hospital for weeks after the battle. Her diary entry from July 15th reads, "Today I dressed the wounds of a Georgia lieutenant who yesterday cursed me as a Yankee girl. Today he thanked me and showed me a miniature of his wife. We are all simply people in the end, beneath these artificial divisions." The U.S. Sanitary Commission and Christian Commission arrived within days, bringing desperately needed medical supplies. But it was the local women who formed the backbone of the recovery effort. They cooked, cleaned, nursed, wrote letters for the dying, and somehow maintained their own families amid the chaos. Elizabeth Thorne, still pregnant, found herself digging graves when male labor was scarce. "I helped bury 105 soldiers," she later testified. "My husband returned from the war to find me gaunt as a skeleton, but our cemetery properly tending to those who fell." When President Lincoln arrived in November to dedicate the Soldiers' National Cemetery with his famed Gettysburg address, many townspeople attended the ceremony. Daniel Skelly, who had watched the battle unfold from various vantage points throughout the town, stood not 50 feet from the president. Years later, he would recall, Lincoln looked worn, almost defeated, despite the victory that had been won here. Perhaps he, like us who lived through those 3 days, understood that such victories come at a cost almost too great to bear. 4 months after the battle, with thousands of wounded still convalescing in town, Gettysburg began to attract a new kind of visitor: the curious, the mourners, the early battlefield tourists. Some came seeking lost loved ones. Others came simply to witness the place where history had turned. For the townspeople who had endured the battle, these visitors were both a burden and a blessing, bringing needed commerce, but also treating their private suffering as public spectacle. The battle was already transforming from lived experience into legend, even as they still worked to rebuild their shattered community. In the years that followed, Gettysburg slowly rebuilt. Bullet holes were patched in walls, though some residents chose to leave them as reminders. Artillery damage to brick buildings was repaired. New structures rose where old ones had been destroyed, but some scars could not be mended with mortar and brick. 5 years after the battle, Sarah Broadhead reflected in a letter to her sister, "Not a day passes when I do not hear the guns in my dreams. The children who lived through those 3 days are changed. They play at burial details instead of tag. They can identify the types of artillery by the sound alone. What manner of inheritance is this?" The physical transformation of the town was remarkable. By 1870, most visible signs of battle had been erased from the town proper, though the surrounding fields still yielded grim harvests of bullets, buttons, and bones with each spring plowing. Tourism became an industry unto itself, with former residents like Daniel Skelly becoming battlefield guides for visitors eager to understand what had happened in this previously obscure Pennsylvania town. According to records in the Chicago Tribune, the citizenry of Gettysburg found themselves unwitting custodians of national memory, with their private properties and personal recollections suddenly elevated to the status of public heritage, a burden few communities in history have been asked to bear. For many women of Gettysburg, the experience transformed their understanding of their own capabilities. Sally Myers, who had never imagined herself as anything but a schoolteacher before the battle, went on to become a leading advocate for better veterans' care after witnessing the suffering in the field hospitals. "The war revealed to us capabilities we never knew we possessed," she wrote in 1875. "No woman who cleaned maggots from the wounds of screaming men will ever again believe herself too delicate for any task." The children of Gettysburg carried particularly heavy burdens. 10-year-old Albertus McCreary, who had cowered in the Wagon Hotel cellar during the bombardment of July 3rd, developed a nervous condition that caused him to startle violently at sudden noises for the rest of his life. His schoolmate Frances Garlack lost her hearing in one ear from the concussion of a shell that exploded near her family's cellar window. Some residents could not remain. By 1870, approximately 1/5 of the families who had called Gettysburg home in 1863 had relocated, seeking places unmarked by such terrible memories. Those who stayed often spoke of their decision in terms of duty rather than choice. Liberty Hollinger, who had been 10 years old during the battle, explained her family's decision to remain. "This is our home. If we all left, who would tell the true story of what happened here? The generals have their historians, but who speaks for the people who lived and died in these streets?" The relationship between the townspeople and the battlefield itself evolved in complex ways. Initially a place of horror and loss, it gradually became hallowed ground, then a park, then a tourist destination. For the original residents, this transformation sometimes felt like a form of erasure. John Rupp, whose tannery had served as a Confederate hospital, complained in 1891, "Visitors come and want to know where Pickett's men fell. They care nothing for where our town bled. They treat us like props in their grand national drama, not realizing we had our own tragedy here." The economic impact of the battle created lasting divisions as well. Some families, like the Kendall Hart merchants, profited enormously from the post-war tourism economy. Others, particularly farmers whose lands had been rendered temporarily unusable by the detritus of battle, struggled for decades to recover their losses. The inequality of these outcomes strained previously close-knit community bonds. Perhaps most poignant were the unexpected connections forged in the aftermath. Elizabeth Thorne, who had dug graves while pregnant, later corresponded for decades with the families of soldiers she had helped bury. Tilly Pierce, who had sheltered at the Weikert farm during the battle, married a Union sergeant she had nursed back to health. And Basil Biggs, the black farmer who had fled before the Confederates arrived, became instrumental in the creation of the colored section of the National Cemetery, ensuring that black soldiers who fought for the Union received proper recognition. The 50th anniversary of the battle in 1913, few original witnesses remained. Those who did attended the Great Reunion, where Confederate and Union veterans, now elderly men, met on the battlefield in reconciliation. Catherine Foster, by then in her 80s, watched from her porch as former enemies shook hands on Seminary Ridge. "They make their peace," she reportedly told her granddaughter. "But some of us who lived through those days can never fully do. So, they had their 3 days of battle. We have had 50 years of aftermath." The final civilian witness to the battle, Albertus McCreary, died in 1953 at the age of 97. With him passed the last living memory of what it meant to be caught between two armies in the greatest battle ever fought on American soil. Yet the legacy of Gettysburg's civilians endures, in diaries, in letters, in oral histories passed down through generations, and in the spirit of a community that survived unimaginable trauma and emerged to tell its story. Their experience reminds us that wars are not fought only by soldiers, and battles do not end when the armies depart. For the people caught in between, the struggle continues long after the guns fall silent. The true heroes of Gettysburg may not have been only those who charged across open fields or defended rocky hills, but also those ordinary citizens who, finding themselves in extraordinary circumstances, discovered within themselves the courage not just to survive, but to help others survive as well. In their quiet resilience lies a different kind of valor, one no less worthy of remembrance than the martial courage that history has more readily celebrated.